This is Spaghetti Test. I'm Jill Newman. Today, Carole Leblanc, public policy expert, educator, scientist, and author of 3 books on climate risk. Carole has served as the Director of Engineering and Research at the Department of Transportation, as Special Expert for the Department of Defense, and she's the recipient of the esteemed Defense Special Act Award. In 2001, Carole became the first American woman to graduate from the doctoral program in Sustainable Development and Management at Erasmus University, the Netherlands. Today, Carole talks about climate science and public policy, working at the Pentagon as the only woman in the room, COVID vaccines, and starting a teaching career in her 60s. In her own straightforward and humorous style, Carole Leblanc educates and shares her stories. Let's get started. I really appreciate you sitting down and talking with me.
Well, you're more than welcome. I'm delighted to be here.
Are climate change and global warming really referring to the same phenomenon?
The terms climate change and global warming are not interchangeable. They mean different things to me as a scientist. But is that really important? What folks really need to know is the basic fact that there's just too much carbon in the atmosphere. And the consequence of that extra carbon in the atmosphere is warming the planet up. And that warming is what's causing climate change.
And what does that say?
Climate change, to me, says a lot of different things. It says species like insects are behaving differently, longer seasons, interfering with hibernation. So global warming is just the impact of that increased temperature. And climate change is everything that happens on the planet as a consequence of that. Very detrimental to so many species, including humans.
All over the world we have protests, and we've had them for decades. Are they helping? Are they making a difference?
I consider myself to be a child of the 70s. We did a lot of not just good outreach and marches as young people, young adults. But that outreach, that activity, actually ended up producing good public policy. So let me give you some examples. We did things that resulted in the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act. It's President Nixon that formed the EPA,
Wow.
the Environmental Protection Agency. A previous atmospheric crisis that we conquered because we went from protests to the public policy arena, and that was with the Montreal Protocol and the ozone hole in the poles, right?
Explain what that is, if you would.
Human interaction with the atmosphere, which ended up causing a deleterious effect, in this particular case, the ozone hole. And we got together and wrote a treaty, an international treaty called the Montreal Protocol. All the countries got together and said, we've got to ban these things. These CFCs, and people are going to go to sleep. They can Google Montreal Protocol and
Right.
find out the chemicals that
Sure.
were banned there. Some of them were also global warming, though, the connection there. There is definitely a connection there.
I may be cynical, but it seems like countries sign agreements but then don't necessarily stick to them.
And some countries, like China, at times, didn't do the treaty like they were supposed to, and we would catch them because, of course, now we've got these satellites that show where things are. Another example, of course, would be, Brazil and deforestation. You can see that now from outer space. So the same thing happened when countries signed the treaty and then did something against the treaty. They got caught, China in particular.
If you had 60 seconds to get across the gravity of global warming to somebody, how would you go about it?
If I were in a classroom, I've been teaching this now for 5 or 6 years at a local university, I show one chart. One chart. As scientists, we're all told we have to do experiments in triplicate, right? And the kids totally get, most of my students are freshmen, and they totally get, if you do the experiment, you need to do it 3 times because you could drop something on the floor or you could take an incorrect measurement. So my go-to slide, and I realize, this is all audio, but there were 3 different groups of scientists looking at the atmosphere over quite a lengthy period of time. Let's say from the Industrial Revolution in about 1800 to the present time. And they were doing these measurements looking for artifacts of this increase in temperature that we often refer to as climate change. In the polar regions, We can dig deep enough.
Okay, so they were looking at data that was generated back then, but
Yes.
they weren't actually looking at it back then.
No, good heavens. No. But it is fascinating that those isotopes, when we dig up the cores and you see all the little
Yeah,
tiny
It's
bubbles,
fascinating.
and we measure the isotopes and we can date them, and we therefore can look at the concentrations of these molecules over time, right? So 3 different sets of people, different labs, one in the UK, one in the US, and I forget the third, over a couple of 100 years. And the graphs are pretty much identical. So forget what I just told you about triplicate. You're talking about thousands of replicate data points. That should do it for you and I. There really is nothing more that I can add to that. Interestingly enough, there's a wonderful professor called Edward Tufte, Tufte. Gosh, I can't remember where he's from either now. Is it Yale? He wrote several books on the visualization of data and how important that is, the visualization of data. Had folks at NASA grafted the chart of the temperature and the gaskets that would fail when we lost our astronauts on that cold snap in Florida, they never would have launched. It was just that obvious, right? So is this chart with the thousands of points that were replicated in different parts of the world, looking at the atmosphere. Ironically, that used to be enough for policymakers to do the right thing. I would be the only woman walking into this very mahogany room at the Pentagon with literally my knees knocking. Very masculine feel. Very out of place. I was very uncomfortable.
A lot of testosterone in that room.
But
Someone needed to open a window.
Well, we were in a secure room and we were in the
Yeah, no
basement.
windows.
So anyway,
Were you in the Situation Room?
no, never. No,
That's
never.
at the White House.
But I did bump into Barbara Starr at CVS. We have a mall in the Pentagon. And CNN's Barbara Starr was shopping in there with me. She's a very short woman, very surprisingly short. She may be about 5 feet tall. Anyway, I digress. So I'm in this room with these incredibly, people here need to hear this too. We have some amazing people in the Department of Defense at high levels, and that should get everybody that's a U.S. citizen at least a feeling of safety and security. I've got nothing but awe and respect for these all men. I wish I could say there was another woman in the room, but there wasn't. So anyway, I give them my data, and that's all they needed to make decisions. The discussion never went to, well, the graph is wrong, or let's study a tiny, tiny piece of the graph from like 1898 to 1890, where there might have been this tiny little blurby thing. I never felt like a used car salesman, is what I'm trying to say. With the Pentagon and their ability to make good, sound public policy decisions based on data, you know?
And so where once it was enough, now it's not. Why do you think that is?
I don't know. And it has bothered me so, and I don't know if you want to get into this right now, Jill, but when I retired early because there were things, working in the government, I know everybody thinks, or maybe people don't think this, but let me tell you, there's a lot of stress working in the government. I'm sure there are a couple of people that, don't work hard, but for the most part, there is no doubt in my mind that people die of higher heart failure rates at the Pentagon than a lot of other jobs. There's a lot of stress. You're trying to keep very young people, right out of their teens, right out of high school, safe. These kids, and to me, they're kids, haven't married yet. They don't have children yet, and you want to make sure that all that happens well for them. So for 5 years, I never took a vacation. I loved my job. It was really a calling for me. And that's true of a lot of people in government. I want people to hear that. But I retired seeing that a lot of my colleagues were dropping dead at their desk. And I loved my work, but I also knew that work wasn't the only thing I wanted to do. So there's other stuff that came along. It was personal and happy stuff. So I left government thinking, I'm going to gather the experts that I know around the world on the atmospheric problem we had solved with the Montreal Protocol, which, by the way, in this country became the Clean Air Act amendments under the first President Bush. So the Clean Air Act amendments under the first President Bush was our national
George
response to the Montreal Protocol. Very proud of that. So I thought, I'll retire. I'll gather my colleagues from this era of atmospheric pollution and how we fixed it, write a couple of books, let them be contributors, and we'll move on from there. And then the 2016 election happened. I think my first workshop, international workshop, was maybe in October, and the election was in November, and it was like a line in the sand. To me, everything changed overnight. And I went from trying to share the information that myself and older colleagues had to young people to simply protecting the information. That's another story because things got taken off the web. And then from not even protecting the information, but protecting the scientists. Somehow we became the enemy, which to me, I wish to hell I had a drinking problem. It would have been easier to handle. So in the space
there's always weed.
2 years, I went from just trying to share the information to make sure it had a place to live. My books are in the Library of Congress and in the New York Public Libraries. And then from there to protecting information, and then even having to worry about the scientists themselves.
This line in the sand, was it a policy of that administration where they literally shut you down?
Well, for the first time in my career, the example, I'll give you a very specific example. So the contributors to the books are amazing. I just come out and ask people to do stuff. I said, you're not going to get anything out of this. This is what I'm doing. Can you help me out and write a chapter? So I had folks from the CDC talk about the Zika virus. I had the EPA, of course, talk about environmental policy. And with that author, one of the graphics that he had sent me was fuzzy. And I knew it wasn't publishable. I had to get a clearer, cleaner version of this graphic. And I knew it was on the EPA's website. So I went searching for it on the website. It was just a simple graphic that talked about indicators. Indicators are things in climate science. I don't want to bore you people to death. What are the things that go into, like, what are the elements? If you're baking a cake, you need flour, you need butter, you need salt, you need sugar. There's indicators like that for climate change, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I go looking for this lousy graphic. It's just a graphic. It would be as if when you looked for a cake recipe, a message came back and said, I'm sorry, what's a cake? If you're on recipes.com, right?
Yeah.
So instead, what I get, instead of the graphic, I get a blurb that comes up that says, this website has been taken down until it better reflects the opinions of the President of the United States and the EPA administrator at that time. Well, my eyes glazed over. I've been doing this work for 25 years.
I can't believe it. Did you get a screenshot of that?
Well, it's interesting. I totally mentally shut down, and again, I wish I drank. But I was so appalled and so shocked that no, I didn't take a screenshot. I was just so flummoxed, right? But in the context of that week after, it took me 3 days just to come out of the funk I was in.
Were you angry?
I was too
Before that.
Beyond angry. I was just, understand me, when government does research like this, taxpayers are paying for it.
Yeah. So we have a right to the information. It's
well,
ours.
You would
we own it.
think, yes. Okay. So it happened that I was having this conversation with another university researcher. She'd had the same thing happen to her, only she had saved the screenshot or the place where I had found it. So I was able to go back, find the screenshot, and did publish it in the book. But I have never, ever, ever, ever seen that. It was as if, for the first time in my career, there was a disconnect, a total disconnect between government and policy. Government no longer represented policy. Government was just this thing. Its body of work was no longer policy. I don't know what it is. Again, I'm not a psychologist, but government was no longer the policy machine that it's supposed to be. Government's work in Washington is to generate policy. That's their job.
Yep.
That's their one and only job.
Yep.
And that was gone. That was gone. So then I found out that CNN had done an investigation and had found the same thing, that websites were being taken down. Now, every administration has a right to promote whatever their policy thrust is going to be.
Yeah.
And there's the key word, policy. Yeah.
But not censor information
right.
that the public has a right to know.
Yeah.
Journalists were being threatened. Were scientists?
Well, they were certainly, there's a scientist that I write about in one of my books who's from Maine, and what they do to scientists that were speaking truth to power is they move them around. They change their job descriptions. So they make it difficult to stay in the roles that they're in and work effectively. So that's to some degree discussed in the book.
What you're talking about here does not have a political slant.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I will reiterate, I've worked for mostly Republicans. And my favorite boss, whom I just admired so much in the Pentagon, was a gentleman by the name of Alex Beeler, right? A Republican. Mm-hmm. So for sure, I don't want to come across as someone who's doing that, because it would represent about 25 years of my life's work.
Yeah.
But that's what makes it so heartbreaking for me, though, too, because I have to tell the truth. Yeah. I don't know how my former Republican bosses feel about all this. I'd be afraid to ask them, because if I'm as disappointed and disillusioned as I am, I can't imagine what they're going through, given their life's work. Because remember, these were my bosses. Sad.
Wow. Not everyone can be a public policy maker.
Right.
So
there are two things at work here. There's not everybody wants to be a scientist, but they have to have information, like you were saying, in order to act a certain way. But the sad fact is, and no one wants to hear this, but the reality is that individual actions are not going to be enough to save us. It's not recycling. It's not the things that you and I think of every day that we can do. It's not that. It's not enough. Has to be good public policy based on sound science. That's my background.
But people still have to feel like they're doing something.
So I certainly have young students, and I don't want to be demoralizing and depressing to them. I don't want to tell them, sorry, folks, the world is coming to an end. I will tell you, they will inherit a different world from us. I will tell you right now that the analogy, again, I use as a teaching tool is to think about a really hot tub full of water. You turn on just the hot tap, and you fill up the tub till it's full, and it's piping hot. And think of how much time has to elapse before that full tub of hot, hot water is something you can jump into. Uh-huh. That's our atmosphere. NASA calls that the lag time. So right now, we know that the atmosphere is really doing quite a bit of healing because of COVID.
Yeah.
So when you think about carbon, too much carbon in the atmosphere, one of the first industries you should think of is transportation, right? So we all stayed home. Cars weren't running.
Yeah.
Air pollution cleared up. Helped climate change, right?
Yeah.
But still, it's going to take time. So this next generation is going to be looking at, and we don't have time to talk about mitigation and all that stuff, all the technical stuff that comes with that. But I do want to give kids hope, right? But I want to give kids hope in them. I don't want to give them, this is going to sound ironic, I don't think technology can save us. We are the only ones that can save us. Don't fall for the falsehood that somebody's going to come and invent our way out of this. Mm-hmm. Because whatever new thing we invent, whatever technology we invent,
has a footprint, a carbon footprint.
We never know what those unknown risks are. There's never been a technical advancement without some slippage on some other risks, right? That's just the nature of science. Just like these vaccines, they're wonderful, right? But of course they have little bits and pieces. Right now we know that folks that are taking chemotherapy that are based on immunotherapy, right? After being vaccinated, they're not developing the antibodies that they need, right? Mm. So those are just issues that come up. That doesn't mean the vaccines are bad. Everybody should go out and get them. But there are going to be thousands of people that are in this boat. Mm-hmm. They're going to have to be revaccinated when they become healthier and maybe aren't on these chemical regimes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so as a scientist, beware of that. I can tell you. If a scientist says there are no ill effects, if they're not lying to you, they're misleading you. But what do we know works? What we know works for a fact is stop polluting. What are the bad consequences of that? There are none. So people, what you want to do with, you say, well, I'm frustrated with this. What can I do? And think of what you like to do. Think of what interests you. And in one of my books, I list the organizations, my top 10. What you want to do with your efforts is you want to, because of the power of climate change, because it is global, you don't want to do your activity, whatever it is, recycling, whatever. You don't want to do that alone. You want to match that up with somebody else. That's the public power, the only public power we have right now without the public policy piece. So you want to look at local community level activity, the way President Obama did in the Chicago area. That's how he began his public policy, public career. So I'll give you an example in our own area. We have York Ready 100%. York Ready 100%. That's the town of York wanting to be energy sufficient as a community. So if you happen to live in York and you're interested in energy, that's the group you want to join, right? So the table that I lists the major organizations. If you're a college student, the one out of Vermont, 350.org, all over the globe now. So you want to think about what interests you in an environmental activity way, and then look at organizations. And in the book, like I say, I list the organization and what they're known for. And then consider your activities in line with those, because that's the power. And that power comes from voting. Mm-hmm. What does AARP and all the, for older folks do? They have a connection to the legislative houses at a state level.
They have lobby groups.
Yes. So that's another important point. National is fine, but what's really missing for folks is the importance of local elections. It's not just good enough to vote for the president and senators. What you want is you want to vote for selectmen, select women. You want to vote for mayor. You want to vote for town clerk. All of those local legislators, officials, really feed into that other state and national effort. If that was never visible before, it's visible now with the, and again, I'm talking politics. I guess it's just part of my nature.
Yeah, but politics is a part of everything. It's,
to me, it is, and I don't see that as an evil either. I see that as the people's way.
It's the vehicle for getting things done.
So right now, the big lie, right? So right now, you see folks from Pennsylvania, local officials, going to Arizona to learn about how to mimic that fourth count of whatever it is ballots in their state as well. So those local public officials are very important right now, wouldn't you say? Mm-hmm. And maybe prior to the 2020 election, you really wouldn't have thought how much sway, how much power local state officials would have had. So maybe that's a good, as long as the democracy comes out stronger, maybe that's a good learning point. But I'm still not convinced that it's going to come out right, that our democracy will be okay. But that's just
it is an experiment.
Yeah, that's just how important local elections are.
So you retired, and then you found yourself standing in the front of a classroom teaching undergrads. I would love to hear that story.
It's hard for me to talk about teaching without getting very personal, and I hope that's okay. It's
Please
just
do.
A very, very personal story. So I would be nothing without my own teachers. So I came from a fairly dysfunctional family and have had pretty much an all-Catholic education. First in grammar school, and then in high school and all-girls Catholic school, and then even as an undergrad at Boston College. And without that support system, I owe so much to my church and to my teachers. I just would not be who I am today. So that's number one. So I never ever would have thought of myself as a teacher because I hold teachers in such high esteem. I just couldn't see myself ever making that kind of an impact on anybody's life like my teacher. I just would not be who I am without my teachers. So I retired from the Pentagon. I had, for many years, vacationed in Maine and just loved Maine. And so the opportunity came to buy this antique farmhouse that needed a lot of work, and we'll leave it at that for the time being. But the people that I bought the house from were themselves teachers, and they were just so kind to me. I would have done anything for them. And the gentleman said to me, there's a job at UNE that I want you to apply for. And I, honest to God, I'm a very bad liar. It isn't that I'm good, it's just that I'm a bad liar. And I didn't want to have to lie to Ed to say that I had applied for the job if I hadn't. So because he asked me to apply, I just sent my resume in, and I never thought anything of it. And in fact, when I got hired, I wasn't really interviewed. I was interviewed over the phone. It was just a conversation. Mm-hmm. And so it was one of these things that, I just wanted to make sure Ed understood that I appreciated him thinking of me, mm-hmm. but that I certainly wasn't looking for a job. Uh-huh. And now I had the job, and that was surprising. What was I going to do now? So I had to show up, and I have to tell you, I was terrified. I can't tell you. I was so ill-prepared. First of all, in fairness to UNE, so you don't think they're horrible for hiring me, I mean, they were looking for content people. They knew that my background was in chemistry and public policy, and that is indeed true. I'm very comfortable with those topics. But what the hell did I know about teaching it? Well, nothing, right? So I walk into this classroom, and they're mostly freshmen, and what am I? I'm in my mid-60s, and they were just so different than what I remembered myself being at that age, that I was absolutely lost and absolutely terrified. And if you know the area at all, this campus sits right on the ocean. It's beautiful.
Yes, it is.
And
I've been there. I've attended it for 2 years.
Well, I would finish my class literally at a gallop, get to my car, covered in sweat, to get the hell off of campus as fast as I could. I was just that terrified, And I was thinking all the time I was teaching, remembering what my teachers were like, how much damage I was doing to these poor children, So anyway, what saves me is the content. I know the content well, but I did not know this generation. But I would say it took me, at the beginning I was terrified, but in about 1 or 2 years, I do feel bad for those first couple of classes, though. That Catholic guilt will follow me to my death, but I just have no idea how those children ended up. But at any rate, after 1 or 2 years, I was not just used to them, but I really loved them, mm-hmm. and it was a very different feeling for me. And I hope I've done some good there. So yeah, there was no plan. It was more like a serendipity type of thing. And now, from what I understand, as an adjunct, I've been there longer than any current adjunct. But that makes sense, right? Because I'm retired. Oftentimes you teach part-time like this as a stepping stone for your career. You want to be able to write that down. Well, where the hell am I going to go? Yeah. So the other thing it does for me, though, is it keeps me... I have to keep on top of my game, because so much of science changes. And in order to teach this class, like part of my class last year dealt with the COVID virus, mm-hmm. So, you have to keep yourself current when you teach. So, but I'm sorry to disappoint you, there's no plan.
And what exactly do you teach? What courses do you teach?
Environmental studies. I think the name of the course is Intro to Environmental Principles. So certainly things like pandemics, mm-hmm. climate change, those are chapters in the book. Mm-hmm. And
do you use your own books for the class?
Yes, and I am thrilled with UNE for that. I have a lot of academic freedom. What they told me, and they're absolutely right, is to teach to your skills, teach to the things that you're good at. Mm-hmm. And so that is indeed what I try to do, which is so current, though. Could it be more current?
I understand the percentage of women in STEM professions is still very low relative to men, particularly in technology and engineering. I'm really interested in who's sitting in your classroom right now.
The majority of my classes are women, and I'm thrilled with that. Now, Can I speak to why that might be? There's a couple of things that when I talk to the kids, and for me they are kids, I ask them about that, how come so many of you here are women? I think it has to do with the fact that you would never think of UNE as a party school. These kids don't come to UNE to do a lot of drinking. There is this I do know, that women mature faster than men. So mm-hmm. at 16, if you take a 16-year-old boy and a 16-year-old girl making these decisions, you can see where a lot of females would end up perhaps going to school like mine. But regardless, I'm thrilled with this because mm-hmm. the statistics are still correct. And this too represents a really personal story for me. And maybe this is a point of encouragement, because I am so disappointed in the world that I'm turning over to young women in terms of when I was in my 20s, the world I envisioned for other young women in their 20s today would have been very different. I would not have believed that the statistics could have remained so poor, could have remained so bad. But I do want to empower the men that might be listening to this, because the reason I'm a scientist is because of my dad. So, first of all, I'm a proponent of same-sex education, which is contrary to what you might think, right? But as a young high school student working with just other girls, you just weren't distracted by all those hormonal kind of things.
Same-sex education meaning Catholic boys' schools and Catholic girls' schools.
Or it don't have to be Catholic.
With uniforms.
Yeah, because you're just not distracted. You at that age, you're so worried about what everybody else is thinking of you that you're not going to raise your hand. You're going to be worried about what they're going to think of you and all this kind of crap. That all goes away in high school if you're just with your own gender. So that just worked for me. But more important, truly, was the fact that in the 50s, before it was cool at all, my father said I could do and be anything I wanted. And when you're 5 years old, you just believe that. I idolized my dad. I just thought, well, okay, that makes sense to me. Tragically, the opposite is also true, right? You can really put a child down in that powerful position of parenting. But when a parent says that, the child just goes with it. It's not smart. It just is. I guess it just didn't occur to me that I couldn't do something. But it is nonetheless very disturbing to me that we are where we are with the genders in science and technology, engineering and math. But I say this knowing that there are men that are going to become fathers to little baby girls, and they need to know how powerful that role is for them and how much I owe my dad for saying that in the 50s to me. I owe him a lot. You know, the other element that speaks to this in my life has been my faith. So you've got wonderful folks like Martin Luther King, who did say the arc of the moral universe curves towards justice, but it's a long arc. I'm terribly misquoting that. That is correct. But I do think we set ourselves up for failure if we think that we're going to see justice in this life. Now, as a Christian, that does not mean I sit on my laurels and not do things that work towards that justice, right?
That's the only way that justice will come is if everyone continues to work towards it. Yeah.
But my faith gives me that power to do that in a positive rather than a negative way, because I know I'm Jesuit trained. What I mean by that is there really is no justice for me without God. But thankfully, that justice is meted out with mercy. So I guess if you don't, it's going to be tough if you don't have faith in a way to me, because if this world is all you've got for justice, you're going to be disappointed, to say the least.
Yeah, because life isn't fair, and that's something
the only thing you can count on is the fact that life's not fair. So you've got to make
death and taxes.
Yeah, and you've got to make a mental decision to be grateful. So what am I grateful for? I am very grateful that I was born as an American woman. You know, think of what else is out there in the world if you happen to be born on a different continent as a woman. So the gratitude has to come first, because then you can work in positive as well as instead of negative ways, I guess. So, you know.
Thank you, Carole Leblanc.
Yeah, you're welcome, Miss Jill. Till next time.
Do you promise to do this again?
Yeah, of course.
Carole's books, Demystifying Climate Risk, Volumes 1 and 2, and The Perils of Climate Risk, The People and the Science, can be found anywhere books are sold. Be sure to listen to my next conversation with Carole Leblanc, where we dig a little deeper into government and public policy, climate change and jobs, young people and the important role they'll play, and a few stories that will definitely make you laugh. Join us.